In part one, we looked at why software and UX projects use Lifecycle. So we compared the structured, inflexible waterfall model with the more iterative, adaptable Agile model. And we saw how usability eventually became important enough to require its own formal process. So now, let's take a look at the UX lifecycle and how it actually works in practice. The UX lifecycle starts with understanding the needs. So this is the analyze phase where we define the problem and understand the users. And then we move to the design phase where we come up with the design ideas or the solutions, and then we move on to prototype the designs and then finally evaluate them. And based on the evaluation, we can reassess the needs. And around we go, iteratively improving the design until we get to the point where we're happy with our design or the final prototype. And not only do we iterate through the entire cycle, but we also can iterate within each phase. And so, here is the more comprehensive model where you iterate through the entire process, and you can also iterate within the cycle. And you can even move back to the previous development activity based on the feedback or the discussion that you had. And unlike the waterfall model, activities in different phases can overlap as they don't have such clear-cut boundaries. So for example, sketches can be used to support rapid and frequent design idea explorations, but they also can be thought of as quick, dirty prototypes as well. So we're more flexible in this regard. Yet we still have to establish some criteria for the activity transition, meaning that we can't just stay maybe say in the ideation phase forever. So how do we know when it's time to move on to the design phase or to the prototyping phase? And this is why it's important to set some criteria when you're writing your early documentation so you know when it's time to go on to the next phase. And that's going to depend on whether your goals have been met, how much risk you're willing to take, and how much resources you have, whether that's time or money or personnel factors. And overall, we have to remember that navigating through the wheel or iterating through the cycles is a process, not the outcome. And the goal is to ultimately move into production. So we always want to move to the next phase if possible. The Agile UX design process that we just looked at is designed to work in harmony with the Agile software engineering process that we looked at earlier, with the sprints. So here's a diagram on how the UX design and software engineering activities are really closely aligned. Each box in this diagram is one round around the wheel. And as you can see how they feed into each other. For example, UX design cycle 1 influences the sprint 1 as well as UX design cycle 2. And sometimes feedback from the implemented feature from the SE side or software engineering side can also influence the UX portion. Another thing that determines the process is the complexity of the system that we're building. In other words, process is a function of the system complexity. And this is important to keep in mind because no single product can achieve every aspect of usability perfectly, meaning that a single system can't be both super easy to use and highly efficient and completely error-proof. You have to make some trade-offs. So we have to decide what is the usability dimension that we want to prioritize, or what is the appropriate process to use. And we're going to have to decide this based on a system of complexity that you see here. On the horizontal axis, we have the work domain complexity. For example, here in the high work domain complexity corner in the top right, we have things like air traffic control or rocket science. And these are going to be mainly collaborative with many dependencies, legal and ethical requirements. But on the other hand, if we have a low work domain complexity for things like everyday shopping or maybe a simple calendar app, these would all be lower domain complexity. So on the vertical axis, we have interaction complexity. So low interaction complexity typically corresponds to smaller, straightforward tasks that are easy to perform on the system, like maybe clicking on a button or to order a product from a website. So in contrast, though, high interaction complexity is linked to larger, more challenging tasks that often require specialized skills or training, such as manipulating an image with Adobe Photoshop. So here we see how work and interaction complexity should determine the process that you use. So first, in the upper right quadrant, we have systems that are both complex in both interaction and domain, and the more safety and security related things that you might have to consider. So the process here should be rigorous with little or no tolerance for error. And we're going to do lots and lots of testing. So this could be lots of in-lab user experience evaluation because we're dealing with domains and interaction to the level of rocket science. And we don't want to say, oops, we launched the rocket in the wrong direction. Or if we're building systems related to actual physical buildings, then we want to make sure that the buildings don't collapse. And also for complex interaction and work domain systems, traceability is also very important. So we're going to leave lots of documentation. And for these systems, innovative or radical designs are not always welcome. So if this is the type of system that you're building, then the waterfall approach could work pretty well. On the other end of the diagram, we have simple interaction and simple work domain, and most consumer products are going to fall in this quadrant. For example, building a website for like buying flowers or building an app for checking the weather. These are pretty simple and common tasks that don't mean that the product itself has to be very simple, but it mainly means that we're going to focus a little less on rigor and we're going to place more emphasis on emotional impact. So it has to be, fun to use and engaging. And so we'll prioritize ease of use and aesthetics. So for these systems, the Agile process could work pretty well with a focus on design. Next, we have systems that are complicated or complex in interaction, but have a simple work domain. For example, something here would be like a digital watch. The domain of telling time is simple, but the interaction can be quite complicated. So, think of trying to set an alarm or changing the time just using 2 buttons. It's actually not always intuitive. So for systems like this, the focus is really on the interaction design and task structure. So breaking down what users are trying to do into tasks and subtasks is what we're trying to accomplish. And since the domain is simple, we can spend less time on user research or contextual inquiry and more time on the ideation and sketching out interactions and then testing them. And lastly, we have systems that have simple interaction but complex work domain. So in this case, the interaction can be as simple as filling out a form or typing in some numbers, but the domain itself is complex. So think of systems like tax preparation software, healthcare.gov or DocuSign. So, doing your taxes involves complicated rules and logic, but the software usually, if it's good software, usually aims to make the user experience as streamlined and as simple as possible. So oftentimes it's just a matter of going step by step through a form that hides all that back-end complexity. But the biggest challenge in that kind of system is helping the users understand the domain. So what's happening behind the scenes and why they're being asked certain questions has to be in the forefront. And that doesn't mean that we want to show everything that's going on in the back end, but just enough so that the interactions make sense and they feel easy. So when we talk about the process here, we want to do things like priority analysis, whether that's business analysis or task analysis. And then we also want to focus on the information architecture. Till now, we looked at simplified or summarized UX design life cycles. But next, we're going to take a look at the usability engineering life cycle by Mayhew. And this methodology explains exactly what types of activities should be occurring at each stage of the design process. And it focuses on usability, as the name indicates. So here's the entire life cycle. And I know this could be a bit overwhelming, but you don't have to memorize all the details. You should just know the overall structure of the life cycle. So at a high level, the life cycle is divided into 3 phases. So first we have the requirements analysis or research phase, and then we have the design phase, and lastly we have the installation phase. And each phase includes iterative cycles and decision points that basically make sure that the usability goals are met at each step. So we're going to start with the requirements analysis phase, and this is where we'll create user profiles and do task analysis. And at the end we want to get some usability goals that are set with our users. And then in the design and testing development phase, this involves creating and evaluating the prototypes with actual users. And you'll see that there's 3 different levels. We don't have to know too much detail about those, but just know that at the end we have some form of documentation. Here they show up as these gray note style guide. And we have the documentation that's created at the end and then passed on to the next stage or level. Also, we have certain criteria that we're evaluating before moving on to the next stage. So here we are asking, has this set of criteria been met? And if so, can we move on to the next stage? And if not, we're going to iterate through the current stage again. And lastly, the installation phase focuses on user feedback and enhancement. And once we're done with all that, all the issues are resolved in the installation phase and we're finally ready to ship the product. So that was a lot, but to summarize, we explored the various lifecycle models today, including the waterfall model, the Agile model for software engineering, and usability engineering lifecycles, and each one offers a different level of structure and flexibility. And we also talked about the importance of process in UX design, as process or lifecycle gives us a structured, repeatable approach that ensures reliable outcomes. And we also talked about how the process is a function of system complexity. So before beginning the process, you need to think about, is my system complex in the work domain or complex in interaction? And then you can decide on the process. And lastly, we talked a little bit about collaboration between UX and software engineering and how processes can align. So by understanding and integrating these life cycles, we can create user-centered designs that meet the needs of both users and developers who have to deal with designs later in the process.